Welcome to Points to Ponder. Our point this week comes from the Gospel appointed for the 17th Sunday after Pentecost, and that is in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21, verses 23 through 32. The passage tells a story about one of the many times when the religious authorities of Jesus' own religious faith challenged him, challenged his teachings, challenged what he did and how he did it, but most of all were challenging his authority. In fact, this time they actually challenged his authority directly, asking him, where do you get the authority to do the kinds of things you do? They were puzzled by it. Jesus, however, as he often did not answer their question. In fact, instead, he threw a question back at them, a question that he knew they were not going to be able to answer without getting into trouble with some group. He said, you want to know where my authority comes from? Let me ask you this question. Where did the authority of John, known as the baptizer, where did that come from? Because you see, John the baptizer was a pretty popular character with most of the same people that followed the religious authorities, as well as following Jesus. So they thought about it, and they were puzzled. But by their way of thinking, if they answered that the authority of John came from God, then they would have to confront the fact that they hadn't believed John or trusted in him. But if they said that they didn't think that John's authority had come from God, then the people, the crowds that were their followers too, they would be angry with them. So they said what we often say when we're so puzzled that we can't come up with an answer. They just said, I don't know. But Jesus didn't let them off the hook. He asked them another question. He asked them this question. He asked them, what do you think? And then he told a very short story about a father and two sons. He said this father called the two sons to him and asked them to go work in the family vineyard. And the first son, he was all with the father. He knew the father's authority, and he knew that as a son he was supposed to obey that authority. And so he said, yes, Father, I will go and I will work. But he never did. He just never got around to it. The second son, I like to think he was the youngest, even though they didn't tell us that, he rebelled against that authority. And he told the father, nah, I'm not going to do that. I have other things to do today. But then as the day went on, he changed his mind. And he went to the vineyard and worked very hard and got more done than even the father had expected. And so Jesus turns to these religious authorities. He said, what do you think? What do you think about this? Which one actually authentically did the work of their father? And the answer was obvious. It was the son who said no to begin with, but ended up going and doing the work. It was the authenticity of that son's regard for the authority of his father. What Jesus did was not just create a puzzle for them to solve, for them to spin around and try to see if they could make the pieces fit. What Jesus did was he presented them with a challenge to their way of thinking, He asked them to think about not so much authority as authenticity. And by challenging their usual way of thinking, his hope was that they would learn and that they would grow. Which brings us to our point to ponder for this week. Sometimes we learn best when something challenges our usual way of thinking. My guest today is my good friend Adolf King. And Adolf, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I was born in Trinidad and grew up in Trinidad. And then I went to school in England. And after getting my PhD in chemistry, I went to work in Venezuela, where I worked in Venezuela for approximately 5 years. First teaching at the university and then working for a research center in steel and coal, mainly coal. And then I went to Trinidad. I got a job offer in Trinidad to work at the Institute of Marine Affairs. And as they say, a prophet has no honor in his own land. So it wasn't bad. I just wasn't feeling that I was making progress. I went to a conference in, I think it was Mexico, and anytime I left either Venezuela or Trinidad, I always tried to pass through New York to meet up with my sisters and brothers. And so I was at my sister's house when the phone rang, and it was a call from Oak Ridge asking me if I was interested in a job. And I said, well, tell me a bit about it. I came here to work on mercury, which I did. We were looking at mercury and the streams and things like that. And I was using spectroscopy to determine the mercury. But that grant soon went out, which was a grant he had with ORNL, and that soon died down. And then I worked with a company called IT Corporation, doing chemical analysis on a large scale. But at that time, I also taught as an adjunct at Rowan State. And when IT Corporation began to decline, I took a full-time job at Rowan State, and I worked there for about almost 25 years before I retired about 3 years ago.
A life that's taken you many different places to do many different things.
Well, my favorite thing is to travel. I love to travel, so I go. But you were asking about something that sort of changed my life or whatever. And I was remembering when I was doing what in the U.S. would be considered advanced placement classes. In the English system is a two-tiered system. There's ordinary levels and then A levels. So I just finished my ordinary levels, and to do A levels usually are people who either want to go on to college, because you need A levels in the British system to get into college, or people who just want to continue studying. Whereas a lot of people leave after their 5-year high school and go out to work. So I had just started, and my chemistry faculty member, we were a small group. We were about six of us taking AP chemistry. And he posed a question, and the question was, a bat and a ball together cost $1.10, and the bat is $1 more expensive than the ball. How much is the ball? And without thinking, I blurted out 10 cents. And so then he lectured me. He said, Adolf, you need to think before you speak, and not because it looks simple. Life is never simple. You always have to think about it. And the truth of the matter was wrong. If you set it out algebraically, as he pointed out, you will easily come to the answer. And it actually was 5 cents for the ball, because if the ball is 5 cents, and the back they were then $1.05 since they two add up to $1.10, and therefore I was completely wrong. wrong. But the lesson I learned was don't rush to conclusions too quickly, or as my mother used to say, don't judge a book by its cover. So you always take your time, and you do this for everything, for ideas, for people, for situations. And this has supported me well, because I've always tried to take a second look rather than just jump in, because that answer seems so obvious. And sometimes the obvious is not right.
That's right. What it brings to mind, and I think this was kind of in the point that we're pondering as well, is that we do learn when something challenges us, but it's also true that when something challenges us about a particular way of thinking that we've gotten accustomed to, we're not always receptive, or we don't hear it. And I just wonder if you've experienced that struggle at any time in your life where something challenged the way you always thought it needed to be, and it wasn't something that was easy to hear.
Oh yeah, I've been there. We've had I've had situations when people said to me, well, that's not the correct way to go, or that's the wrong thing you're doing. And I'm saying to myself, you're completely wrong. But when I sit back and use that principle and go back and look at it, a lot of times I've changed my mind on how I will tackle this. And it has helped to do that, to go back and see what else is there. Or as my mother will say, I quote my mother all the time. She's got 500 sayings. There's more in the mortar beside the pestle. So you have to look and see what else is there, and try and see what's going on in somebody's way of thinking. Why are they thinking like this? And why do you think that you are right and they're wrong? A lot of times, if you think about it, it helps to change your way of thinking. They may be wrong, but you still change your way of thinking because you think, I have never looked at it like that before. And again, to quote my mom, you can learn from a baby. So
that is very true. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It also points up, I think, one of the big problems we're having right now in our own society and culture, which is so many people at different ends of the spectrum being so tied to a particular way of thinking that they can't hear anything else. And yes. I wonder if you've bumped up against any of that, where you've had to deal with somebody else who is so entrenched in their way of thinking that it's really hard to even have a conversation. Has that ever happened?
Probably. I remember one of the reasons I left my job, I quit my job in Venezuela, was that they had brought in a new guy to head up the steel area. I was in charge of analytical chemistry. And they brought him in at about twice the salary the other two people of our level were making, myself and Aguado, who was head of the coal. And so we were kind of outraged. And my boss had come to the US, and I put in my resignation and said, I'm leaving. But he wrote back from the US and said, don't leave us yet, wait until I come back, let's talk. And he came back and we talked, and I said, okay. And he asked me about what my demands were and things like that. And I thought about being able to go to conferences abroad and things like that. Anyhow, he told his boss asked him, how did it go? And he said, it went well, he's all right, I know, I took care of him, he's good. Nothing is going to happen now. I forget, he said something like, it's all taken care of, that it's easy. So my boss was really taken aback when he realized that I did leave on that. Now, it wasn't I wouldn't say it was a real struggle, but the point was that he was setting his ideas on how he think it was easy to placate me and not really listen to what I was saying. And I saw that as, hey, time for me to move on.
Yes. That happens so many times because we only see our way of thinking. When there are times when we're challenged in our way of thinking, what do you think has to happen inside of us to allow us to be open to the challenge in a way that we could learn from it instead of just resisting it?
Well, one of the things you have to do, in my opinion, is to get some time to yourself. I always find getting time to myself, reading a book or just sitting and looking at the moonlight and thinking about things. I love 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. My wife think I'm weird. I will sometimes just walk outside into our parking area there at night and just listen. And if you listen, there's a lot of things going on. People don't realize that the night is pretty busy. I hear all these noises, especially in the summer. There are lots of things out there thinking. But what I'm saying is that you can get into yourself and think and reflect and work things out in your mind. Was I right? Did I do the right thing? If you take Venezuela, for example, I was, when I got to Trinidad and was steep in administration and I was asking myself these questions: was I right in leaving? However, time has shown that I was right. So what I'm saying, things change. And the way I see my life, a lot of times, I don't know how I end up in different areas because you are thinking about things and that. When I graduated from high school, I went to work at the chemical plant. We weren't rich, and I was going to work for about 2 years and try to save up some money so I can go to college. And 2 years had come and gone, and my mom said to me, "I thought you were going to college." I said, "Yes, I am," and things like that. So anyhow, I applied to. What I decided to do was, instead of go straight into university, was to do a refresher course. And I applied to a school in England to do a refresher course. And my visa was taking a long time to come through, and they were giving me a hard time and things like that. And my big sister, who was living in New York for years now, said to me, "Why don't you come up? We can send you to university up here," and things like that. So this day I had an appointment with the embassy, and my mom said, when they go there, if you just tell them to give you your passport and you come back, you're going to the US, you're not going to UK. And when I got there, to my surprise, the guy just handed me my passport with my visa stamped and everything. So it turned out that it was like a miracle. So the point I was trying to make is that every time I move from one place to another place to another place in life, it seemed as though I wasn't in charge. It's just something else was working. You think about it and it just moved. Right? You just go in the direction you're going. Similarly, I went to Imperial College, which is, I guess, is equivalent to the U.S. Harvard. And I was going, we had an expedition that went to Greenland. There were 10 of us went to Greenland. And I had applied I had graduated with my bachelor's in chemistry and applied to Loughborough University to do a master's. And I went up and interviewed, and the interview went well and everything. So I went off to Greenland, not thinking anything about grad school. And when I came back, there was no slot for me. Loughborough said, "We sent you a letter and you never replied. So we gave your slot away to somebody else." And so there I was in England, And I only had a few months because if I would have overstayed my visa, and then I was thinking about what I'm going to do. And it was late. It was, we came back at the end of August. It was the beginning of September. Schools in England start up around September. And even though it's graduate school, they're still starting at the same time. And everywhere I checked, no slots available. And so I went down to Imperial College. And I remember this guy saying to me, "You're going to Imperial College? You think you could get in there?" Anyhow, I went, and the day I went, I waited for almost 2.5 hours before I saw the dean. And the dean said to me that he didn't have any more vacancies in for research students, but that Professor Kirkbright may have some, so you can go and speak to him. And if he's willing to accept you, I'll give my nod. I went down to Professor Kirkbright. We had a good talk. He questioned me about what I did and how much chemistry I knew and things like that. And then he said, "Okay, I'll accept you into a master's program. And then if you do well in the master's, then we'll move on to the PhD." It was just great, great. Because a lot of people then think I could get it into Imperial College. And, the time for the exams and things like that had gone. It's just, so again, as I said, it's as though I was put in places which I didn't plan it. I didn't have a lot to do with it. Some divine being intervened on my behalf. And so I'm usually very grateful for that.
Adolf, thank you so much for spending this time with me.
I hope it was useful.